Good evening, everybody. We're starting at, not bad, eh, Stacy, 5:01. I'm going to be very, very brief tonight because I have just a couple of things that are of great importance to say, and most of all, of course, to welcome Yvonne Krastev. But I should first say who I am. I'm Robert Austin from the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. But when I look out of the audience, I just said to Yvonne, maybe it's time to move on when you know everybody in a room. But I'm especially happy I see so many students and some old friends too, particularly Yvonne. But before I hand over the podium to Yvonne, and I'm going to introduce him, but he doesn't like when I introduce him because I've introduced him 5 times this week, and I've tried to make it different every time. But I'll keep it short tonight, okay, Yvonne? But the big question you ask when you have an event like this is, how do events like this happen? And, you know, it seems easy because here at the Monk School, we are probably at the leading edge of public education. And I know that all of you benefit from it. The students benefit from it. The public benefits from it. I benefit from it. And it's quite an operation now. I think, I'm looking at Jillian there, who's our Director of Communications. And I would think you can clap for her, by the way. Because, you know, we've had such a week. It's such a fall, and it's partly because of the legacy of the pandemic, where we were stuck online, and now we get such a great opportunity to welcome you all back. But we're very blessed with this amazing team of people who help us put these things together, because Yvonne, you know this, it doesn't happen easily. Yvonne's at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and they also have an extraordinary events calendar, so he's very familiar with this. So, but let me start by saying I want to thank Peter Lowen, who's not here, but he's our director. He saw the value in this project right from the beginning. So he provided not only financial support, but also moral support, because you want encouragement from your colleagues to do things. And Peter was very excited about this. You know, to say you're bringing Yvonne Krastev here is kind of an easy sell, because he's quite well known. You understand, you see him in the New York Times, you see him in the Financial Times, you see him in the Guardian. And as I said, you have this amazing events team, which is absolutely perfect people. You can't work with better people. They're always happy about what they do. Stacy's standing right there. I clap for her because she's so helpful. And she not only helped put this together and all this stuff, but she was really helpful in finding Yvonne and his family, because Yvonne came with his wife and his son. And his son is 13. And Desislava, his wife, Desi as we call her, so we had to find a decent place to live. This is not easy in Toronto. Okay, and Stacey, special thanks for finding Yvonne such a pleasant place to live, okay, for the week he was here, because everyone was very, yeah, but trust me, you don't want to buy a house in Toronto right now. And you know, aside from that, I want to thank Daria. She seems to have disappeared right now, but I don't know if you saw her. Daria is not just a former student, she's now a friend, and she's pregnant. We just had her shower today. So we had a baby shower today, and that was really beautiful. And she's not here because maybe she'll get emotional. Daria and I tend to get emotional together, so that's why she left. But special congratulations to Daria. She's expecting her second child. Is she around there somewhere? That is not Daria, by the way. There's someone else. This is a group of people I don't know at all, okay? But they seem like very nice people. I'll pause for a second. Come in and sit down, ladies and gentlemen. It's a little bit easier if I do it that way, all right? I want to thank also a very dear friend who's sitting right there, is Edward Schatz. He's the director of SARAS. You can clap now. Do you need me to tell you when to clap? Yvonne, I have to help them along here. You know, Ed, we call him Schatzy, by the way, at least I do, which is the German word for treasure, okay? Because he's a treasure. But he also encourages me, because I tend to come up with crazy ideas, and I say, let's do this, and Ed says, okay, let's do it. And he's been a great source of support. So this is the kind of university side of how this thing comes together. But there's a deeply personal side to this story, ladies and gentlemen, a very personal side, and Yvonne knows the story well. And this is where I could get emotional, but Yvonne, you watch me here, okay? We rely on people who are outside the university to do things, right? And we rely a lot on donors. And the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, formerly the Center for Russian and East European Studies, in the 90s particularly, but in the early 2000s, we were surrounded by these wonderful people who wanted to support the study of largely their homelands. So Hungarians, Bulgarians, Czechs, I can go on, Slovaks, etc. But in this process, we ran into a couple, and Yvonne knows them, Veneta Eliev and Danny Filipovic. Veneta is a Bulgarian Canadian, and Danny was a Serbian Canadian. And these two, particularly Veneta in the early stages, were devoted to raising awareness about Bulgarian issues. Veneta was a devoted cultural enthusiast, and she wanted to bring Bulgaria as much as possible to Canada. She had a radio program, and she was the foundational donor to Bulgarian studies here at the University of Toronto. And her husband, Danny, was also a foundational donor to Serbian studies and more generally Balkan studies. So we had these two wonderful people. They lived extraordinary lives, by the way. They came from tremendous hardship, having left Bulgaria with the communist takeover. Danny left with the communist takeover in Yugoslavia. They built businesses here, they made lives, and they gave back in an extraordinary way to this university. And they really enriched the lives of students, particularly, because that was their thing. Get students to Bulgaria, or Serbia for that matter, and get students from Bulgaria to Canada, and they did that. Both of them lived really long. Vanetta died in 2014, if I recall, Yvonne. She was 102, all right? And she told me the key to her success, and here you get free advice, was to live on oatmeal and fish. I'm not doing that, as you can tell by looking at me, but I still think it might be part of my future. Her husband, Danny, lived to be 97, and they left a profound legacy here. And one of the key sources of support for Yvonne's visit comes from the legacy of these two wonderful people, Vanetta Eliev and Danny Filipovic. The next part of the story is that, how did I meet those people? Right? You know, how does a guy from Toronto meet these two Bulgarians? I met them because there was another very special Bulgarian Canadian in this town, and his name was Daniel Damov. This was a great guy, okay? And Mr. Damov just died in January of 2022, so it's not been that long ago. And Dan and his wife, Elizabeth came from Germany. She was from Berlin, in fact. He was from Sofia. She was a refugee from the collapse of Germany in 1945, and he was a refugee from the Bulgarian communist takeover. They met in Paris and then eventually came to Canada. But it was Dan that put us all together. And Dan left such a legacy here because he was not just a donor, he was an extraordinary friend. And him and his wife, Elizabeth, proved to be, for me, really extraordinary role models because I think they set the tone for what a life of civic duty means. They were committed to their homeland, one Germany, one Bulgaria, but they were also, Yvonne, you remember, totally enthusiastic Europeans. They really bought into the European project, particularly the notion of Franco-German cooperation. And Dan contributed enormous amounts of resources to make that possible. So as I said to Yvonne, and he might come to this in a second, but when Yvonne's here, and he's been here a few times, I cannot but think of Dan and Elizabeth, because probably our paths would have diverged a little bit had it not been for these two wonderful people, plus the two other wonderful people. So this intersection of these four people bring us all together in a very interesting way, and I think it sends an important message to all of us, especially in a time of extreme peril, which we live in now, and the importance of doing good work and doing good things done by good people. So having said that, these four people coming together, now I have to say a few things about Yvonne before I hand over the podium to him. I've known him since 1999. 1999 is emblematic because I was very involved in Kosovo war, particularly in Albania, and we met in the aftermath of that. We've decided that 1999 is a real watershed, and I think Yvonne might explore some of those issues with you tonight. The world you thought changed in '89 actually changed in '99, particularly if you were on the front lines of the war in Kosovo in 1999. You'll see, and I think this will probably come out of your conversation tonight. I'm not saying a lot about Yvonne. He's a wonderful essayist and a wonderful writer. I await always with great excitement when he sends me a link to a new article, whether it's Financial Times, New York Times, or The Guardian. As all of you know, connecting to U of T is he won the Gelber Prize in 2020 for a co-authored book with Stephen Holmes called The Light That Failed, which is really a journey into what happened with liberal democracy. That book takes on extraordinary relevance, especially today, as we look at what the Russian Federation is offering us. And I mean, it's offering us. It's not simply a war with Ukraine, everybody. This is a totally different dimension we're living through right now. That said, we've been intersecting for 20 years. We're going to be together in Vienna starting in January. I'm handing over the floor to you. A little bit of instructions. Yvonne's going to talk. We're going to have a Q&A, and then we're going to have a reception. But ladies and gentlemen, I have nothing else to say. The floor belongs to Yvonne now.
Robert, thank you so much, and be sure that reception cannot disappoint you. The talk can, and I really want to start and say how grateful I am to Rob and all the people that organized this, because it is strange what I'm going to tell you, but the first time I came, I was slightly uneasy because it was all these Bulgarian studies. I have never met Damdamov before, and I was slightly uneasy of being treated as professional Bulgarian. You know this, you go everywhere, and because you're coming from a small country and you ask only to talk about your own country, and you have the feeling it's too much. And then I came here, and it was totally different. And when we have been talking with Robert, the cities, particularly the foreign cities, this is places, but also their people. And anytime we have been talking and seeing, with Damdamov we have been very close. I have been sending anything that I was writing. So this is coming here when he's not there. It's slightly like visiting Paris if the Eiffel Tower is going to be removed. It's very personal in a human way. But also I decided to use this opportunity for this talk much more to share certain type of reflections and questions that I'm seeing kind of unraveling. And I don't believe that I'm ready to be giving you a kind of a classical, well-structured, well-argued frame of what I see coming. But I'll start with the fact that normally we tend to misrecognize the times in which we are living. Either we believe that certain periods are very important and certain moments, and that they turn to be much more trivial than we expected. Just imagine the last 25 years, how many times we said that the world is not the same anymore. Or we basically try to trivialize really historical ruptures and kind of not understanding the importance of it. And for me, the best example of this is I remember years ago reading the diaries of a Bulgarian minister who was in government in 1939. And I went to see what he has written on September 1st, 1939, the day the war started. And basically, this is what was in his diary. He said that with his wife, they visited Family N. And they said, we have a lovely talk, and they have an incredible wine. And then there was 3 lines about what was cooked and how it was cooked. And the last sentence was, we stayed a little longer because Germany has invaded Poland. And this is quite important. By the way, the life of this person was totally marked and changed by the fact that Germany invaded Poland. He probably never recognized that this was probably the most important moment of his life. But this is what we are all doing. And the story was, is this the moment, as historic as we do believe? To what extent this war is different than many other wars that we have been seeing before? And I'm saying this because in the last week, you have 2 speeches from 2 very different political leaders that are making a very strong claim that we are basically on a historical threshold and we are really in a situation in which the world as we know it is not here anymore. The first happened on October 27. Russian President Vladimir Putin was speaking on Valdai, and this was a very well orchestrated speech which was very much targeting the international public. It was done after the end of the Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. It was done in a moment, the same day. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov talked to the Chinese Foreign Minister, and the idea was that this is going to be a historic speech. Mr. Peskov, the spokesperson for Mr. Putin, declared that this is a speech that is going to be studied by the future generations. In a way, in their own view, the speech of Putin on Valdai was to equal basically his speech in 2007 in Munich, in which he basically sent the message that Russia perceives the very existence of the international liberal order as a security threat. And in this basically speech, the president made several statements, and I'm not going to conceptualize and summarize them, but 3 of them were important for what I want to present to you. The first is he said, the decade that is coming is going to be the most dangerous and unpredictable in any moment since World War II. And to be honest, when a president of a nuclear power says this, you can read it as a prediction, you can read it as a promise that he can make it the most dangerous and unpredictable. Secondly, he said what is at the heart of this moment is a major tough challenge on the Western hegemony in the world, And he basically is seeing Russia and the Russian Federation as the leader of a global anti-colonial movement. And thirdly, he said, going back to Lenin, he said, we're in a situation that Lenin was going to define as a revolutionary situation. The top cannot do it anymore, and basically the masses are not ready to live with the situation in the way it is more. What struck me in the speech were three things that directly connected to the argument that I want to present to you. And the first was total fascination of President Putin with the language of the American cultural wars. He was speaking as if he was basically on an American university campus. He was talking about basically the West trying to cancel Russia. It was very much about this very strong language of cultural wars. The second was the problem of mirroring. He was all the time basically making all his statements. He's saying, for example, the West is doing this and that, and I want to put the mirror in front of them so they can see who they are. And this obsession with mirror and mirroring, which we have been interested already when we have been working with Stephen Holmes on the book On the Light That Failed, I found particularly important. But the third incredibly important for me moment in this speech was the total absence of the idea of the future. Everything is totally focused on the past. In a certain way, we're going to remake the past. We're not going, there is no any kind of a promise for particularly normative order. It was very much about the past. The next day, after Putin gave his speech, which I don't know, is it going to be studied by the students at the Toronto University some days or not, there was another European political leader that, in my view, gave a very important speech, and this was the German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And listen, Steinmeier, who used to be a German foreign minister during the annexation of Crimea, very important figure, former leader of the Social Democratic Party, and a person who is always famous for understating. Extremely moderate. He's not a person that is going to say that he's going to write a speech that others are going to study. So he came and made also a kind of an important speech, which was directly addressed to the German nation, but also to the Ukrainians, because he was doing it after visiting Ukraine. And it was not an easy for him, because there was a moment in which the Ukrainian public was very critical, blaming on him the softer position of the European Union after the annexation of Crimea. So this is a history, and he made 3 points which are also of particular relevance for my talk. First, he said, attack on Ukraine is attack on all the lessons that we have learned out of the World War II. And secondly, he said, Germany made a big mistake. We universalized our own experience. We basically started to believe that what happened in Germany after the post-World War II is the way basically the world is going to look like, and that this should change. And he was basically strongly supporting the German move for rearmament. For somebody who knows the social and political circles from which he's coming, listen, this is revolutionary. Social democrat of his generation to ask for the rearmament of Germany, this is an identity change. And thirdly, what was very important, he said, and he knows President Putin very well, he said, it is not that President Putin break the rules and end the game. He basically cast, he cast the board itself on the floor. We are living in a totally different world. Why I'm saying this? Because when we talk about historical change, revisionists like President Putin, they all believe that the old order is dying. If you're going, and this is part of the challenge, he believed it in 2007 that the Western domination is on its last days. He was repeating it, of course, after the annexation of Crimea. Germany was the country that was most reluctant to believe that post-Cold War European order is dying. Because Germany, much more than the United States, have been the biggest beneficiary of this order. As somebody has said, the end of history is an American book, but it was a German religion. This was the idea that we're living in a totally different period, that economic interdependence is the only source of insecurity, that no major war is possible in Europe anymore. So thinking and trying to make sense of these two speeches and basically what they're telling us about the world to come, I was reminded that almost on the same day when Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th of February, in the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, a new exhibition was open, and the exhibition was called Who Are You Really? And there was a series of kind of rooms in this exhibition, but the last room was the mirror room. And basically the organizers have been asking the visitors to come to the exhibition and to donate their own mirrors. And they're putting them in the room saying that the most important is everybody to see themselves in a different mirrors in order to understand who you really are. I'm making this because my first argument is going to be that what we are seeing is, in my view, the distinctive feature of the international order that is in making after basically the end of the post-Cold War liberal order is that it is going to be defined not so much by the clash of ideologies, but very much by the rise of identity politics on a global level. This is much more the struggle to force others to see you in the way you want to be seen, and basically to define others who they are. And this is why this kind of metaphor of mirrors and broken mirrors was so important for me, because suddenly mirroring is becoming critical. When Finland declared their interest to join NATO, the Russian president, Putin, said, I cannot understand why they're doing this. And the response of the Finnish president was, look at the mirror. So this type of a story that something dramatically is happening and that we try to force on others to understand who we are and basically how we want to be seen, I find it critically important. And as a result of it, in order to understand what is ending, we were very much forced to reinterpret and to reread our experience from the post-Cold War period. I'm saying this because when people are saying that the liberal order is now challenged and according to President Putin dead, and even according to Steinmeier, very much in a different world, we have an idea that very clearly we know what had happened in 1989, and there was a lot of talk about the Western triumphalism about 1989. And here's the story. All of you who are doing this period know very well. After 1989, there was no triumphalism. After 1989, there was a major anxiety. If you're going to see the major books that have been written after 1989, and I'm going to touch on Fukuyama before, it was the books of anxiety. Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the critical person during the Cold War, his book of 1993 was called Out of Control. Huntington, it was about the clash of civilization. Kaplan, it was the coming anarchy. Why I'm saying this? Because interesting about the article out of which Fukuyama wrote his book is that it was written in the spring of 1989. It was written much more before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this was a book that does not assume the collapse of the Soviet Union. His major idea about the end of history was that communist ideology was totally exhausted, and even the communist elites do not buy it anymore. But this was not the world in which he expected that you're going to say these major geopolitical transformations. Even at the end of the 1990, the senior top panel of the top American specialists on Soviet Union, they have been asked by the Pentagon to judge the probability of the Soviet collapse, and they said that the probability is not more than 30%. And they said nations used to commit mistakes, but they very rarely committed suicides. Why I'm saying all this, and this is my third point, because when people are talking about the early 1990s and about the emergence of the post-Cold War order, the most important is to understand that the founding partner in building this order was not Russia, it was Soviet Union. And paradoxically, Soviet Union has a totally different interest than Russia when it comes to the international order. President Gorbachev was very much interested to join a much more post-national type of a European order, because for him, this was a kind of precondition for the survival of the Soviet Union after the end of communism. Basically, this was the expectations that a very strong anti-nationalist message coming from the European security order can be used by the Soviet Union in order to combat the rising nationalism of the republics, which was already visible in 1990, 1991. And this is why suddenly the Soviet Union was very much interested to talk about universal human values, having a very strong anti-nationalist language. Russia was born out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their idea of sovereignty and their understanding of sovereignty was very different than one. In a certain way, Russia was trying to define its own nationalism and not basically to fight. And this is critically important also, in my view, for the Putin's generation. And this is quite often for us to try to mix what is happening now with the Russia's war in Ukraine as the attempt to restore Soviet Union. President Putin is not trying to restore Soviet Union. He's trying to restore Russian Empire, which is something totally different. And if somebody is really kind of not convinced in this, I'm strongly advising him to read the speech which Putin did on the February 22nd after the recognition of the separatist republics. This was a violently anti-Soviet speech, in which basically he was speaking not as a red colonel, which he was, but as if being a white general. And his major claim was that Russians, as an ethnic group, are the biggest victims of the Soviet rule, that the Ukraine is a totally artificial country invented by Lenin, and basically he was seeing his kind of invasion into Ukraine as a unification, ethnic unification war. It was very much classical Russian ethnic nationalism and not a kind of a communism that was going on. And from this point of view, one of the most tragic figure in all this war was this old Ukrainian lady who met the Russian army with the old Soviet flag. She didn't realize what was going on, because in a certain way, what the Russian army did was totally to destroy the Soviet identity and the way it was existing in part of Donbass, because for these people, exactly because they were coming from the Soviet Union, they were Ukrainian citizens without asking themselves, are they Ukrainians or Russians? The moment when the Russian army entered, they have a very binary choice. They should be either Ukrainians and fight for the independence for their country, or Russians and stay on the side of the aggressor. And this is not the first time we are seeing this. During the Yugoslav wars, the first thing that happened in Bosnia was the destruction of the Yugoslav identity. Before basically the war, around 30–40% of the population of Bosnia was going to identify themselves as Yugoslavs. When the war started, you're either Serbs or Muslim. Otherwise, basically, you're going to be shot on both sides. I'm saying this because, in my view, this is critically important to understand, and this is where we have been discussing so much with Rob about this. When we talk about the liberal order that basically President Putin hates so much, and he believes that it is an almost existential threat for the existence of Russia and Russia's national interest, this liberal order was very much born in 1999 during the NATO war in Kosovo. And this was when the normative order, which was emerging, was based on certain type of assumptions, which now basically the Russian leadership is openly fighting. The first assumptions was the primacy of the individual rights over the state rights. Basically that individuals matter than the states, and that the international community has the right to defend the human rights of minority groups and people, even going beyond the sovereignty of a nation state if the state is repressing savagely their own people. Secondly, and this was very important for the Kosovo war, from the Western perspective, Kosovo was normatively important because this was one of the wars which you cannot explain neither by the abundance of natural resources. When you basically go to fight in Kuwait, the question is what you're fighting about, people or about oil. And it's a fair question. Not about ethnic similarity. In Kosovo, the West was fighting for people who were not like us. It was the Muslim minority. So this was a very much kind of a universalism of disorder that was critically there. And the third part was that the West basically took on itself the position to speak on behalf of the international community, because this was the operation which was not sanctioned by the United Nations. So the famous decision that it was legitimate but not legal was critically important. The United Nations did not support the NATO operation. This was also a critical moment in Russia's relations to the West. In the moment when basically the NATO operation started, back then, Russian Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov was flying from Moscow to Washington for the meeting with the Vice President Gore. When they informed him, when he was already above the Atlantic, that NATO has started bombing in Kosovo, he turned his plane. And it was the turn of this plane, to be honest, if you go to speak metaphorically, this is this plane that now you can see bombing Ukrainian cities. This was the radical kind of a change of a Russian policy in which Russia, and this was not only Putin, but basically this was this Putin's turn, which says, we're not part of the victorious coalition. This is an international order which is against us, and very much this is a threat to Russia itself. And all the Russian policies in the time to come was very much there. This is also where the Russian population changed very much their view on the West. 37% of the Russians has changed from positive to negative their view on the United States as a result of the Kosovo War. I'm saying this because it was exactly this order that have been very much attacked. And this is the major claim which you're going to see in the Putin speech of 27th, in which he said, universalism cannot be anything else than imperialism. Any kind of claim that there is something more than kind of specific rights can be only imperial. Funnily enough, the irony, and this is probably the best and the worst in history, when you have a former imperial power trying to recolonize certain parts of its territory, at the same time claiming itself as being the leader of the anti-colonial movement, this does not sound particularly convincing for most, but this is exactly where it comes from. And this is not a classical cynicism. This is something that for me is very important. Normally when you listen to these people, you say, he knows that what he's saying is just total bullshit. He's saying this simply for instrumental reasons. This is not the case, because in his own political imagination, you have the hegemon, the United States or the collective West, and he is against this. And as a result of it, he's talking to others, to Indians, to Chinese, and the most important in this talk is that he knows something that is very important. It is very difficult for all these former colonial people to identify with Ukraine, not because they like Russia so much, but because Ukraine's allies are their former colonial powers. And this is a difficult story. For example, President Zelensky was interested to speak in front of the Indian Congress, and the Indian Congress refused to allow him to go and to speak. Normally, you can expect that these people can identify it very easily with what is happening in Ukraine, because you have the former imperial power going there and trying to reoccupy. But they said, no, no, this is not our colonial empire, it's a different one. And for me, this is why, and I go to my next argument, I'm unconvinced to the people who are claiming two things with respect to the coming international order. One, that basically we are back to politics of a classical realism, and John Schmischheimer and others were making the argument, nothing difficult, everything is about state interest, this war is about Russia responding to the expansion of NATO. If this was the case, then the Russia should become mad of the fact that Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO. Listen, because of the fact that Sweden and Finland are joining, now the border between NATO and Russia is going to be 1,500 kilometers. If you're really thinking in these classical security terms, in which everything is about increasing kind of your security with respect to NATO, you can expect that Russia should be kind of a totally ballistic about what is going on. Suddenly, you're going to see that Russia almost did not comment on this. It was a very muted response. While they're saying that if Ukraine is going to join NATO, this is the end of the world, basically Sweden and Finland joining NATO is just a footnote. In security terms, obviously, it makes you believe that you're not treating all the neighboring country in the same way when it comes from the point of view of the security perspective. Because, listen, Russian American missiles are going to be as close if they're in Finland or if basically they're in Ukraine. But obviously, we're talking about something else. And this is why this attempt to try to see, okay, what is going to come out of this war is very much a classical balance of power, state interests, in which basically the only thing that countries are doing is maximizing their security, I find unconvincing. The other thing that I find unconvincing, unfortunately, is also the major narrative coming from the United States is that what we are seeing is a clash between democracy and authoritarianism on a global level. I do believe that differences between democracy and authoritarianism are very important. I do believe that Russia is a classical authoritarian state and Ukraine is a democracy. But at the same time, I can see that the majority of the countries that President Biden invited for the Summit of Democracies do not sanction Russia. It is India, I'm talking about it is South Africa. So all these countries, unlike in the type of the Cold War, this kind of a narrative cannot explain why the democracy-authoritarianism divide, which otherwise is very real, is unable to structure geopolitical space in the way communism versus liberalism divide was doing during the Cold War. And in my view, this is quite important because authoritarianism is not an ideology. Communism was. Communism was a radical ideology based on elimination of private property. It was not simply basically a form of government. So as a result of it, it was much more easier during the 1970s when still there was a very strong push for third way and very strong push for non-alignment movements. But it was much more easier to mobilize a negative coalition, while now we are going to see that basically most of the countries, even when they feel closer politically to the United States or to Europe, the nature of their regime is not defining their foreign policy priorities. From this point of view, it's interesting to see now with Lula being elected in Brazil, and I hope I'm wrong, but I do believe that even when a progressive president is coming in Brazil, he will not change the foreign policy when it comes to the Russia-Ukrainian war. So while the democracy authoritarianism narrative is very strong in Europe, outside of Europe, basically the talk is very much about sovereignty, about national interest, and about identity politics, and this is what I want to argue about. And my major argument about the difference between identity politics and ideological type of politics during the Cold War is that the Cold War identities was very much anchored in the future. The major claims of both the Soviets and the liberal West was future belongs to us. They were coming with two totally different type of societies. And also, I do believe one of the reasons the nuclear confrontations, what kept under control for such a long period of time, was that this was a clash between two optimists. Both sides believed that history was on their side. And as a result of it, basically, they said, why to fight you today when I can fight you tomorrow, when I'm going to be in a stronger position? Now we are seeing a totally different logic. Now the identity politics is not about converging the others. This is about separation. And this can be seen very strongly, for example, in the discourse of the Ukrainian governments. Recently, the head of the presidential administration, Yermak, wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which he declared how much scandalized he was that the Nobel Prize for Peace was giving at one and the same time to the human rights organizations from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Listen, this type of op-ed could not appear during the Cold War narrative. In the Cold War narrative, regimes are evil, people are good. In the Cold War narrative, Turgenev and Pushkin's are the allies of the West against the Soviet regimes. In the identity politics very much based on separation, it's quite differently, and Yermak's position was, we don't want to be pushed again on reconciliation and brotherhood and so on. And, so I'm saying this because while many people try to see this simply as the return of the Cold War, some of the features are going to be there, and of course, particularly with the major increasing confrontation between the United States and China, you're going to see characteristics that very much remind us of the Cold War. Neither the narrative, nor the nature of the confrontation is the same. And honestly speaking, in the China-American confrontation, technology is going to play much more important role than ideology. Basically, tell me with whom you are sharing data. Tell me what is the technology that you are using, and I'm going to tell you where geopolitical alliances lies. So as a result of it, this rise of identity politics, in my view, started already after the end of the Cold War, and in a certain way, we missed it. René Girard, whom we have been quoting with Stephen Holmes in our previous book, made an observation which was critically important for us. Because people now like to ridicule Fukuyama, this is not particularly fair. Fukuyama made a valid point. Fukuyama said, there is no major ideological alternative at this moment to the liberal democracy. It was not a classical triumphalist book. He said what is going to happen is that everybody is going to imitate the West because the West has won, because the West was the modern society. If you want to be modern, you should be like the West. Even if you don't believe to democracy, you should fake elections because this is how you feel modern. Where Girard was very much differing from Fukuyama was that he said, imitation is not a cooperative sentiment. I imitate you not so much because I want to be like you, because I want to defeat you. I want to replace you. And he's giving, in one of his literary studies, a beautiful interpretation of a famous Dostoevsky short novel called The Eternal Husband. And the story of the eternal husband is the following, and I'm sure Dostoevsky is going to forgive me how I'm going to summarize it. But basically there is a woman dying, the wife of this man. She was slightly flirtatious. She used to have different lovers. So after her death, he started basically visiting all these lovers, trying to understand why she went for them. And he's particularly fascinated by one of those persons whom he saw as kind of a perfect seducer. So when later he decided to marry somebody else, he invited this former lover of his wife for a dinner, just trying to show him that now he knows how to defend. This one you cannot seduce. I'm saying this because many of the things that different countries in the world have been doing in the last 30 years, by adopting institutions, by adopting best practices of the West, were not so much driven by this kind of a will to become like us, but very much with the idea to be competitive, to replace. And this competitive nature of imitation, in my view, is quite important for seeing many things that, for example, now people see in the way China is responding to the Western world. I'm saying this because already in the 1990s, there were several people who see the changing nature of this move from ideology to identity politics, and one of them was the German poet and essayist Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who in 1993 wrote a strange book called Civil Wars. And basically he said, what is coming after the end of the Cold War is a civil wars. By the way, he was quite right also empirically. After the end, in the post-Cold War period, around 25 million people have been killed, I mean military killed, as a result of a different civil wars, which is half of the number of the military victims of the World War II. So the spread of the civil wars was one of the characteristics of the post-Cold War period. But the most important in his kind of definition of what he's seeing was that this is a violence which does not have a political end, or which does not need to be justified by ideology. This was just the expression. And he was extremely basically captured by the image of one of these military gangs who attacked the hospital of Mogadishu And when they went, they destroyed the Higgs-ray machine. This was the only Higgs-ray machine in the country, which means that even if they themselves one day are going to be sick, nobody is going to be able to help them because this kind of equipment was destroyed. But he said the major characteristics of this new type of a violence that emerge after the end of ideologies is that there is no much distinctions between distractions and self-destruction. And honestly speaking, this is one of the things that I see in the position of the Russian Federation these days. I don't see much difference between destruction and self-destruction. And what he basically was saying, and this is that this kind of intensity of these conflicts, the fact that they're much more difficult to be channeled, was based on the fact that during the Cold War, you try to convert the other side. You try to make them like you. In the logic of the Civil War, you either want to destroy, to eliminate. The claim that Russians are Ukrainians simply means that there is no Ukrainians. If you're right, if you believe this, this is it. And I'm saying this, and I'm going to the last part of my presentation. I do believe that this rise of identity politics, both on the level of domestic politics and on the level of international politics, has a lot to do with the demographic changes in our societies and some of the major demographic anxieties that we are seeing. One of the most important things to understand and to realize in order to basically, in my view, understand this type of an argument I'm trying to present for them is to understand that one of the first things that the Russian Federation did after they invaded Ukraine is that they voted a special legislation which is guaranteeing a fast adoption of the Ukrainian kids which were taken from the country by the Russian families and giving them Russian citizenships. By the way, there was a great article being published some weeks ago in the New York Times. But this is very important because President Putin was always very much obsessed with demography. I should say that we share this obsession. Before the war, on several occasions, he made one and the same statement. He said that the famous 19th century Russian scientist, Dmitry Mendeleev, had been predicting that in year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. Well, now there are only 150 million, and he was blaming this, of course, on the wars and the Bolshevik revolutions and to a certain extent even of the post-communist transition. But during all his kind of rule, Putin was always stressing as his major success that at some point he managed to reverse the demographic decline of Russia, because after the end of the Cold War, the life expectancy in Russia went down 5 years. And basically the average age of a Russian man in the 1990s was 64 years. This was basically like in some of the most poor African states. Alcohol and other things explains part of it, but the most important, it was this obsession with demography. And then suddenly you're adopting it. We're talking about tens of thousands of kids. So we're not talking about individual cases. We're talking about tens of thousands of kids which were immediately given for adoption. So why you're doing this? And the basic story is I really believe that this kind of a fixation on one level of demography, and because of COVID, Russian demography went very negative. Russia was one of the countries with a very high excess deaths. 1 million people have been lost. You have something that historians of early American history know very well, the so-called morning wars, in which basically some of the Indian tribes go and attack other tribes just to kidnap kids or to kidnap basically women and so on, because they start to fear for their basically demographic and political reproduction. The idea is that Ukrainians should be Russians, Belarusians should be Russians because there are not enough Russians in the world. And this kind of a very strong claim and this kind of a very fear of a demographic anxiety, we're also seeing in the domestic politics of some of our countries. I'm seeing in Eastern Europe, to be honest, when basically some of supporters of President Trump in 2020, they said that if these elections are not going to be basically denounced, this is going to be the last elections, because as a result of demographic changes, we cannot win any elections anymore. This is a major change. And out of the title of Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, what we see basically is the last man. Certain way, the idea of the future has been very much eclipsed. And I'm going to end up on this because what really worries me very much on this kind of a rise of identity politics on a global level is that future is critically important when you're trying to reconcile the differences between countries and so on. Future is where the cooperation takes place. This is the expectations that tomorrow we're going to do better, that we can rearrange it in a different way, that is making the relations between states, like the relations between people, critically important. This total fixation on the past and this kind of a fear of the end, and to be honest, the COVID pandemics very strengthened this type of a sense of catastrophe of ending. There is a lot of people following, personally the Russian president saying that his isolation for a long period of time contributed very much to this type of apocalyptic view. This is something that I find particularly worrying about the international order that is appearing. Because the apocalyptic mind functions differently. If you believe that you're the last, if you believe that the current elections are the last elections, democracy cannot function. Because democracy is based on the fact that when you're losing elections, you're not losing much, and there are always next elections that you can win. If you believe that these elections are the last elections, there is no democracy. If you basically believe that if I'm not going to act now, I'm going to be unable to achieve anything in the future, this of course is creating a world with much more escalation. I'm saying this not in order to scare anybody. I do believe that we are scared enough, but I do believe that for me at least it was very important to try to see the distinctions, because it is much easier, but in my view also intellectually lazy, to go back and to believe that either we are back in the 19th century and everything is a state interest and we're just going to talk balance of power, or that we are back to the Cold War. And what is good about the Cold War is that we know how it ended. But in a certain way, I do believe that we have a different type of a political dynamics that we are seeing. And probably both the Russian and the German president are right in one thing on which they agree. We are different, living in a very different world. Thank you so much.
Grab a seat, Yvonne. You would like some water?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah,
You got sparkling water there?
yeah, good.
So I think we're gonna just, so I'll get the mic going here. Yvonne, as expected, an extremely thought-provoking lecture. And as I said, it's never disappointing to spend a few hours. As you know, Yvonne's been with us for a week already. He's engaged immensely with students. He took my class one day, and he's met the MGA students, he's met the Sarah students, and he's really had an extraordinary impact here. And I wish you'd stay longer, but you'll be back. I expect so. So we can have these cue cards. We're doing cue cards tonight, ladies and gentlemen, because that seems to be our new system, and I kind of like it. So the cue cards are not circulating. Are they circulating now? I would take one question from a hand while we're circulating. Monty, I'm not going to you first. You know the rule, right? Monty, I'm going to get the students. I have a rule, and everyone knows the rule. Rule number one is I let the students have the first chance, because I invited a lot of students here tonight, Yvonne, and you've met some of them. So I think it's a nice chance. And students get a little bit shy sometimes, but I think it's nice to give them a chance. So I'm looking at them. I'm making eye contact with all of them, and they're looking away from me. They're saying, why is he doing that to us today?
There is a beautiful Soviet joke,
This is
if you don't have questions. And the joke is the following. A person was standing in front of Kremlin late 1970s and throwing basically posters. And he was immediately arrested, but they didn't look at what is written in. And there was nothing. So the police asked the guy, what you're doing? There is nothing written. And he said, why to write anything? Everything is clear. So probably.
So anyone want to jump in? Last time, by the way, we were here, the last time I sat here, we were talking with Serhii Plokhy. And we had a terrific talk. And then my dear friend over there, Alexander Toshkov, Dr. Toshkov, wrote its best question, but he has really bad handwriting. So I didn't get to ask it to Serhii. But Alex, do you want to, because I owe you one?
Let me think a little bit. There's a lot of things here.
I'm now making eye contact with Professor. I can tell you. Okay, listen. The 1999 thing. I'm glad you mentioned that, because just from me personally, I remember being in Albania in '99 in February for the Rambouillet conference, and you could cut the tension this was thick with tension, and I was asked to go there to determine what the Albanian reaction would be if in a war scenario in 1999. That was easy to figure out, by the way. The Albanians were already actively supporting the Kosovo Liberation Army, and they had, and most of this was not that well known at the time, but they were very active supporting. And then we went again in June during the war, and I remember seeing all this equipment that was piled up in Albania, tanks, Black Hawk helicopters. You couldn't move on the streets of Tirana for the tanks, but the tanks never left Tirana. But the planes were going constantly from Aviano base in Italy. Some were flying, of course, because a B-52 can leave from the United States and bomb and then return to the United States. It's with refueling. And I had a very bad feeling, Yvonne, but it wasn't something you could easily talk about because, as our dear friend Veton Suroy said, and he's a mutual friend, he said, for us, Robert, these planes are like angels. But because from a Kosovar perspective, the NATO intervention was a life-saving intervention, but I had a really bad sinking feeling in that period between February and June '99 as the war started. And I don't know if I'm thinking in hindsight, but I felt...
Listen, one of the interesting stories about this war is to what extent Yugoslav wars has just disappeared. If you're going to read most of the papers, they're going to say that this is the first big war in Europe after the end of the World War II.
Yeah.
By the way, there is no comparison. What is happening in Ukraine now is a major war. I don't believe to what extent people who are not near can understand the number of shells that the Russian army is shooting at Ukraine now is on the level of 1941. We are talking about a major war. This is not a military conflict. Of course, it's not a special operation. The scale of the war is incredible. But what was interesting about Yugoslavia was that compare these two wars. The war in Yugoslavia was perceived to be the war coming from the past. You have this kind of a backward region, people who are kind of slow enough to jump on the new train of history. There was kind of something coming from the past. And this is why, basically, this was not the war Europe was really afraid of to spread out. This was the war on which Europe was trying to make the new rules. What you're seeing in Ukraine is first the fear that this is the wars coming from the future and not from the past. The fear, for example, of nuclear and so on, which of course was not back then. But also what is, in my view, very important is for all period after 1945, there was only one language and only one reference that the Russians and the Americans and Europeans have been sharing, and this was the common history and reference to the World War II, where both sides have been on the same side and on the victorious side. This is destroyed. The moment basically the Russians started to talk about Ukrainians like Nazi, by the way, just for people to imagine, the word which was most Googled on Yandex, the Russian search machine, in the first 3 weeks after the war was Nazi. Russians didn't understand what their own government was talking about. But the moment when you're using this language, and on the other side, the moment when you see that basically Russians are bombing Ukraine the way basically the Germans have been bombing, just to destroy the civil infrastructure, to make it impossible for people to live, the World War II references are not a common language anymore. Paradoxically, the common memories of the World War II have been killed in Ukraine. And this is part of the story, and these memories were so important for the very intellectual and moral foundations of the post-45 all orders, both Cold War and post-Cold War.
Thanks, Simon. I had a gentleman there who had his hand up. Did you want to write it out, or did you want to just ask it? Just ask the question. I'm giving that young man a break because he was first, okay? And then then I have enough Yvonne to get us going. Thank you. Go ahead. But you're going to have to stand up. And you might even be given a microphone, but...
I have a difficulty believing that this is really an innovation. It's the first time that it's done in wartime narrative building. Hitler did it good enough, in an effective enough way that it kept the US out of the war for the first 2 years. Are there other examples of wartime aggressors such as Putin that have used the same technique in the past, and how did it end? Yeah. My point is, How do you shatter these hall of mirrors?
No, thank you. Listen, it's a great question. By the way, in history, nothing is really new. But in a certain way, there is something which is slightly different. And the most important is, if you're reading the speech on Valdai, it's a very Canadian speech. Every second word is about diversity. But the problem is how you understand diversity. This is not about diversity within our own society, and by the way, also about sovereignty, but the problem is how you understand sovereignty. So diversity is about diversity of civilization. Diversity means that nobody has right to impose any universal values on anybody. So in a certain way, basically the major message of Putin is nobody can have the right to tell to the other, be like us. On the other side, of course, he's not saying the Ukrainians be like us, he's telling them you are us, which is in my slightly more radical version. But this idea that you have these very much confined communities, cultural, that they're going to go after different rules. And basically sovereignty is not about the relations of citizens to their own government. This is why the regime nature is not so important. But this is about kind of some imagined cultural and civilizational spaces that should not be mixed. This fear of mixing, this fear of diversity, this is this obsession because of it with those who is fluidity with cultural lives. When I was talking about demography, believe me, part of this obsession, which you are seeing both on the far right, but also in the Russian rhetoric with the gay rights, is very much also demographically driven. This idea that the West is simply trying to destroy Russia, but not allowing them to have kids, because you're kind of using and trying to convince people basically to go in a couples in which they're not going to have their kids. In Russian language, in their propaganda, the word in Russian that they're using for becoming gay or lesbian is the same that they're using for recruiting a foreign agent working as a spy. And this is a very important, because there is this very important generational conflict also within Russia. And by the way, this generational conflict can be also very easily seen in the conflict between President Putin on one side and President Zelensky on the other. This is not just two different political regimes, they're totally two different generations. And Zelensky is, in my view, very sensitive on this. So when he talked about President Putin, several times he was calling him the pharaoh, the Egyptian pharaoh, something which is kind of life and death at the same time, but also out of the modern times, something that you can find in a museum. And I do believe all these aspects are critically important, and this is why, for sure, separation is what most of the wars is. I'm not talking about us versus them, but if you see at Hitler, this is a kind of a classical imperial strategy about space, and of course very much based on race. And you have this fear of mixing, for sure. By the way, what is most important about Nazism is that Nazism is not afraid of the failure of integration. Nazism is afraid of the success of integration. The guilt of the German Jews was not that they were not well integrated in the German society. The guilt of the German Jews was that they were excessively well integrated in the German society. So you have this, and this essentialization of the cultural and civilizational differences is very important, but this is where he believes that this is language to which he can talk to Africans, to Indians and others. So this is the international language. When he was invading on a classical ethnic language. But don't forget, it was not meant to be a war. It was meant to be a special operation. When the Russian side talked about special operations, is what they were expecting to be, something that is going to finish in 3 weeks. You're going to have a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, in Kiev, and that's it. So now when you are talking, and this is in my view the difference between identity politics and ideological politics, you are not interested anymore. For example, you're saying, I don't want United States to become like Russia. The only thing I want is to keep the distance, not to go there. They should not infect each other. Basically, different society starts to, in his view, to look at each other as an infected patients during the COVID. So he basically see the world like during basically the COVID time, when everybody should stay in their apartment and not get out and not to mix with each other.
Okay, Ivan, I've got enough questions, and Alexander, you're really writing a long one over there. Okay, so, but I'm ready when you are. Thanks very much. I'm going to use this. Ivan, I'm trying to keep a thread going if I can, and it's not easy. In addition to thanking you for a very clear position on Russia.
This is good.
Yeah, the thank you is great. I do read when it says thank you. I'm going to tell him, obviously. This is a big picture when you think about this notion of prediction and promising, okay? So what's going to be next? Will international order be repaired? Is it able to be repaired? Big question, but worth
Listen,
thinking
this is part of my argument, and this is why I needed also President Steinmeier. Because normally, even more than any other Western power, Germany always believed that everything that we are seeing in the last decade is a kind of a deviation. For example, when Trump came to power, many in the United States was going to say this is very different. Germans said, just wait. The resilience of the international order is much stronger. In a certain way, it is going to survive. And in my view, basically, we start to realize that there are a series of factors. And in a certain way, this was, Putin's war was one of the factors that basically have been moving this deglobalization that started. But of course, this geopolitical conflict is much more critical for destroying order than things that we have seen before. And the most important is that suddenly it was the Germans who realized that if before you believed that economic interdependence is a source of security, suddenly you discover it is a major source of vulnerability. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were meant to be as security instruments. They were meant basically to make it impossible for the Russians to attack Europe. And suddenly you believe that it became the major vulnerability of Europeans. So what I do believe is that you cannot keep the international order and also institutions. Do you believe that United Nations really can be functional when a member of the Security Council is invading the sovereignty of another state and basically the United Nations can do nothing? So this is on the level of institutions. This is on the level of the major assumptions. But what I found in a certain way the most dramatic from the point of view of a liberal point of view is this total attack on very understanding that universalism itself can only be a threat. Listen, this order was based on the fact that nevertheless that we're different, we're also similar. We have a similar rights and we're going to recognize. And this is why you can interfere and you have the right to say that what, for example, the Iranians are doing or Chinese are doing or the Russians are doing is not right. The moment when you destroy these expectations, we are already in a different world. When you have the institutions, because most of the institutions does not function. Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe with a Russian veto, this is a non-existing organization. So from this point of view, you have a totally dysfunctional institutions. You have a different kind of powers in the world that function much more in the regional context than in any other. So as a result of it, I believe that we are not going back to where we were. And also, I don't believe that we are going back to the Cold War that in the way we know it. We are going to see a major geopolitical contestation, and obviously this time it's going to be much more China, the United States, and Russia. I don't see as a major player in the mid future, but this is not going to be the same, and this is exactly because ideology, and really I believe that much more technology is going to define how the different alliances are going to be kept and how they're going to be organized.
Kate, I'm going to change gears a bit because I can tell by the question that I think it's from a student. I think her name is Anna Georgievich. Am I right? Yeah, that's good. I should become one of, what do you call that, a clairvoyant. Because she's working, I know what she's doing. She's working on a paper comparing the discourse of Putin, Erdogan, and Milosevic. So her question, and I promised her she'd get to ask the question too, so here you go. You've already mentioned some of the key elements of Putin's recent rhetoric regarding Ukraine, but what would you say are some of the features of his rhetoric that differ from leaders like Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia, or more also Yugoslavia?
So first, let's start and make a very simple point. Putin is changing his rhetoric. He's working with three rhetorics at the same time. From this point of view, he's very creative. So it depends how it works. He can talk in a kind of a classical security realist narrative. This is why many of the realists basically believe that they understand him. which is, in my view, slightly not the case. But on the other side, he can go in this kind of a classical Milosevic ethnic nationalism narrative, which he totally displayed on February 22nd. But then you have this international discourse, which is very much about global elites, anti-cosmopolitan, and so on. It's much more the language which is typical for the domestic politics of our own societies. This is what he's borrowing from other people. The most interesting is that because of the size of the Russian Federation, because of the nuclear status, because of the institutional power in the Security Council, this kind of a rhetoric is very different. And the biggest problem for Milosevic was that he's coming with this ethnic rhetoric, but he was the former leader of the Communist Party of Serbia. So in a certain way, nationalism was perceived as the last shelter of the dying communism. By the way, this is, and we have been talking quite a lot in the book with Stephen about this. One of the interesting stories about 1990s in Eastern Europe was why nationalism was so muted. Because the number of the nationalisms was still there, but in Eastern Europe, some of the people that you're going to see now on the right in Hungary or Poland on the far right, they were muted because then nationalists were very much associated with ex-communists. And some of these people had very strong anti-communist credentials and convictions. It was different in the post-Soviet space. But now this is changing, and suddenly this rhetoric becomes global. And suddenly, for example, if you see in the case of Mr. Erdogan, what I found even more interesting between them, these were two European empires which never really was treated like equal to others. So the problem of the Russians and the Ottomans, particularly at the end of the 19th century when the big disintegration of the empire started, was that they were empires, they wanted to be treated like empires, but from time to time they believed that others are treating them like colonies. So this strange mixture in which you are imperial, but at the same time sharing the colonial sensitivities of others, this is very difficult for them. And this is why, in my view, both Erdogan and Putin so well kind of mix classical imperial politics and imperial ambition with this resentment, very much typical. And the same you can see also, to be honest, in many places on the far right, where you have a majority groups that treat themselves as being the biggest victims. This kind of a resentment of empires that believe that they're colonies, this is what I see in this case. But Milosevic was too much connected to the previous regime, too much there, that in order to have the impact that, for example, Putin can have.
Thanks. Anna, that's helpful, yeah? I'm good. I'm glad. I'm going to come to Germany now, okay? Because both of us agreed that the speech by, and by the way, if you haven't read the speech, we used it in my class, you need to read the speech. You know, as I said, this is an extraordinary document that
Yeah,
I think
this is really an incredible speech also. It's worth reading.
you know, it's not just well written, well presented, but it's telling you things that, I don't know, might be to a degree obvious, but you need to be told them.
No, and also it's not a pure rhetoric. In a certain way, Steinmeier is a serious man, which is not so common these days in European politics. So you can see how deep the change in Germany is going when you read the speech, and particularly also you can see to what extent also his visit to Ukraine made him see it very differently. Because don't forget, one of the things that Ukrainians rightly have been criticizing Steinmeier for was he was so much endorsed in the German guilt about the World War II. So he always believed that Germany owns certain things to Russia, because one of the major successes of the Russia in the last 30 years was privatizing Soviet victory in the World War II. Listen, there were all these people fighting. And if we talk about victims, the republic in which most people have been killed was Belarus. Every third person had been killed there. And suddenly, all this is common suffering is disappearing, and you're ending with the military victory parade in Moscow, and suddenly Soviet victory is becoming a Russian victory, which is one of the things that I do believe Europeans were wrong to allow to happen for the last 30 years.
Okay, so Ivan, that keeps us on the same vein. To what extent do you believe that Germany's change in military policy will impact world order? When the war started, Germany, we've just mentioned this, when the war started, Germany only donated helmets and gear, but due to pressure, they donated tanks and put 1 billion to modernize their military. It's a good question.
It's a good question. So let's here. First, I don't believe that it is so easy to change your military standing just by budget. Budgets do not fight. People fight. Of course, this 100 billion which Germany is putting is important, but this investment of Germany is not simply the response of the Russian war. Suddenly, Germany found itself in a totally different world. First, totally security, outsourcing its security to the United States and not being sure anymore that Europe is going to be as important for the United States in the future as it was before. Secondly, part of the rearmament of Germany comes to the fact that other Europeans, particularly East European nations, are also developing an incredible military capacities. Listen, at the moment, Ukraine is probably the third biggest army in Europe, and as you can see, doing better than the first one when it comes to traditional measurement. Secondly, in 2 or 3 years, Polish army is going to be with incredible defense capacities. So we are seeing, this is what in my view many people are not seeing, is that it is not simply the relations between Russia and the West are changing. The relations within the European Union is changing in a big way. Both Germany and France lost a lot of moral authority as a result of their previous Russia policy. Suddenly, East Europeans are coming and saying, listen, we have been telling this all the time. We were telling you that you were wrong. We were telling it in 2008, in 2015. You didn't listen to us, so now don't expect us to listen to you. And this is very strongly and well put in the Steinmeier speech. He understands this. He understands that East Europeans has a point. On the other side, part of the problem is that some of the East European policy is very much a classical identity politics. At this very moment in which Russia is basically controlling 15% of the territory of Ukraine, Polish government made a claim for 1 trillion reparations from Germany for the damages of the World War II. Listen, this is what I'm trying to talk about. Suddenly, future is disappearing. Future is just remaking the past, readjusting the injustices of the past. And what is even more, the Polish government went to the Greek government, to the Serbian government, asking them also to make their reparations. So this is why we're in a situation in which Germany suddenly cannot universalize anymore their own experience. They cannot treat Russia in the way they have been dealing with France in the 1950s. Suddenly, they cannot rely in a world in which military power doesn't matter. I remember years ago, after the Iraqi war, basically German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer said, America is a power, European Union is an experience. But it could be a frustrating experience. It could be a frustrating experience.
Now, Yvonne, as you know, because we've discussed it, this university is hosting a number of students from Ukraine right now, from the Kiev School of Economics and the Kiev Mohila Academy, which for Saris is, Kiev Mohila is one of our original partners, and we're very proud of what we've been able to do in however a small way, but it's extremely important. And I can see the students because I'm looking at them and they're looking back at me and they're also smiling, which is nice. But Jana's right there, and Jana asked a question, and this is something we've talked about, which is relates to the question of Ukrainian identity and of course the impact of the war. My question is about Ukrainian identity and its development. It was surprising even for Ukrainians how united they became. But it's not like war is new in Ukraine. We have war in Donbass since 2014. So why do you think this full-scale invasion particularly consolidated Ukrainian identity, both a political and an ethnic identity? Did I get it right, Jana? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, because this is a very important question. All the time, normally the analysis goes that we got Russia wrong. Honestly speaking, yes and no. What the West got totally wrong was Ukraine. By the way, for very good reasons. But the idea about the Ukraine was dysfunctional society. By the way, the Ukrainians themselves were very much unhappy, high level of corruption, this and that. As a result of it, what was really lost was how modern political identities are built. Here I could be wrong, and Diana will know much more than me on this. But of course, you have a classical, traditional, historical identity, and my colleague Tim Snyder has been very much writing about this. I'm much more interested in this political identity, which was very much based on Russia's policy towards Ukraine in the last 10 years, which is different. Because some of us have been claiming that President Putin is one of the fathers of the modern Ukrainian political identity. Why this was particularly important? Because in a certain way, what outside viewers didn't manage to recognize is that some of the disadvantages of the Ukrainian system suddenly in the moment of the war become a major advantage. For example, the total decentralization of the place. This kind of a strong regional identities in which people are really fighting for their land as being there. Secondly, this moment of, I was very, very much believing, and could be wrong, that the humiliation that the Ukrainians experienced by the fact that in 2014, the 20,000 Ukrainian army in Crimea didn't give a shot to defend their line is one of the sources of the incredible heroism which you see today, but which started already in 2014-15 when people started to volunteer. President Putin believes that he's the greatest expert on humiliation. And he can talk about humiliation for hours. What he didn't realize was the power of humiliation on the Ukrainian side, trying to show him that Ukrainian nation exists. And also, as a result of it, what happened was that when the war started, Americans were very precise in knowing what the Russians would do. But to be honest, American intelligence was not particularly optimistic how long the Ukraine is going to resist. So when they suggested to basically Zelensky to move to Lviv, this is not a sign of believing that Ukraine will make it. And this is the moment, and here comes a point which for me is of critical importance and which is totally not discussed. European societies was developed as a post-sacrifice societies. After 1945, you know the famous quote from Bertolt Brecht, "I feel pity for nations that needs heroes." And this was very much German, but from German it was translated to almost any language. And this type of a post-heroic society suddenly understood that this kind of a national mobilization is not simply a logistical effort. And of course, the West, by the way, contributed a lot to the preparation of the Ukrainian forces. This cannot be, I mean, not only with weapons. In these 7 years, they were not lost years from the point of view of the building Ukrainian army. But suddenly you see the mobilizational power of civic nationalism. For Europeans, this is an ambiguous message. Europe was created as a post-national project. Europe never knew exactly what to do with heroic nationalisms. By the way, the Kosovars being one of the examples. You like them during the fighting, but then you don't know what to do with them because they're different people. And to be honest, Ukrainians are realizing it also very much this, because Ukraine is not going to be the next Poland or even the next Estonia in the European Union. It is totally different. So this is why when we talk about identity, in my view, this political identity appeared on we are different because we have different values. And this is why the very idea of democracy is becoming for the Ukrainians identity claim. We are different because we are different than them. In Russia, there are two things that you cannot elect, your parents and your president. While Ukraine, even in their worst years, you can change in governments, you can change in presidents, and nevertheless, how much you dislike all of them, you have been rotating power. I do believe this is part of the story. But the impact of the success of the Ukrainian nationalism on the domestic politics of different European member states is a much more difficult question. Because many people, for example, the current Polish government and others, they said, we told you. In the absence of this type of a civic nationalism, you cannot defend yourself. All this post-national European project is good for good times, but when the bad times come, you need a different people and different motivation.
Well, I think we can stay in. I'm going to take, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do two more questions. I'm going to let Alexander Toshkov bet in baseball terminology, clean up, okay, for those of you who follow baseball. But I want to say about nationalism, because, again, this is close to me, because speaking of the Kosovars, when the new government came to power, Vetvendosia of Albin Kurti, and then I was invited to the States to give some talk, and I had grave difficulty. My biggest challenge was to convince policymakers, and not just in the United States, but here in Canada, that in the Kosovo context, the nationalists were the good guys. This was near impossible, because they could not see above what they saw as a narrow nationalism. But in Kosovo, the nationalists are the good guys. Agree? Because the other guys are gangsters. That's kind of easy. Or racketeers or something in between racketeer and gangster, whatever that may be.
Listen, the politics works in the way the business works. In order for the business to develop well, you should forget how you made your first million. And in a certain way, for many of the European states, you should basically forget how basically you created your national cohesion, how basically created your national institutions. So when basically starts doing this in front of your eyes, you're becoming kind of much more nervous.
Okay. So this is again, I think this is from one of my students. So let's go to the archetypal nationalist country in Central Europe. How do you reconcile Hungary's recent closeness with Russia in the context of Hungary's communist legacy, and then brackets 1956? Okay? But you can throw in 1848, 1849 for the historians in the audience, right, everybody?
Yeah.
You're all nodding good.
Basically, in a certain way, this is the interesting story about how you're asserting sovereignty into interdependent world. And basically, Prime Minister Orban believed that you're doing this by opposing your allies and not by opposing your opponents. So for him, President Putin was a very important kind of a source of ally in his war against Brussels. And he very much betted on the idea of a kind of conservative revolution in the world, where he was trying to see Mr. Putin, Mr. Modi, Mr. Trump as part of the same trend, and the trend which is going to prevail. This is why this war was very kind of difficult for him. It was difficult because Hungarians are not particular Russia lovers. I was talking recently to one of their ministers, and he said, we don't like foreigners in general, so Russians, Ukrainians, and secondly, he said, we're like an island. But what was very much important, it was very difficult for his relations with Poland. Because for Poland, this war is their war. In a certain way, Poland, basically, this is an existential threat. You have almost 2.5 million Ukrainians now in Poland. Mr. Orban needs Poland also in order not to be isolated in the European Union. So he started this opportunistic game, and his major claim is that Hungary is so sovereign that Hungary is always just talking their own economic interests and others. This sovereignism defined as a kind of a classical self-interest egoism. It works to the extent that what he's doing, and this is very important, you're telling your own people, to be honest, I can see this part in Bulgaria too. You go to your people and say, yeah, there is a war, and of course the Russians are not good guys. But why the Ukrainians believed that you should care about them? We care only about our own. And this idea that solidarity should be confined only in national borders, and that basically, even if this is a bad war, this is not our war, this is something, and from this point of view, it's not very different than what the Indians are going to tell you others, but of course Indians can say that they are far away. He was successful. I see the last opinion polls. Basically, the majority of the Hungarian population is kind of saying this is not our war. Prime Minister Orban is going to have a consultation, which he likes to do in order to show that basically his population is where he is. But for the moment, he's quite isolated. And he made a point, which in my view is also telling you something about European position. He said the only person who can bring peace, which means that he can make deal with Putin, is Donald Trump. So he's betting on the change in the United States. So his real war in which he participates is the domestic electoral war in the United States. And for him, basically, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine is just a distraction.
Thanks, Yvonne. So this is from Alexander Toshkov, who's to my right there. I would be curious if you could flesh out how the recognition of the Russian other, in quotation marks, could proceed if we are to avoid an eschatological mindset. I promised you.
Yeah.
Are we even now?
Yeah. No, listen, it's...
Oh, sorry, I forgot. He's right. Thank you, Alex. I had folded it. Thank you for the talk and the intriguing framework of an identity struggle.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex.
One of the interesting story about the disintegration of the empires is that, particularly in the Russian case, Russian nationalism is the latecomer in the post-Soviet game. So what you're doing and what you're seeing basically is also very much shaping for the next generation of Russian nationalism. Why? Because the Soviet construction and Soviet Union saved the Russian Empire, while all other continental empires basically disintegrate, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Soviets saved the empire, but it was also a totally different project. And one of the projects was that in order for the Soviet Union to survive and the Russians to keep part of their power should be much more invisible and also institutionally weakened. Within the Soviet Union, all republics has their own communist parties and their own governments, with the exception of Russians. There was no Russian Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and there was no Russian government. So from this point of view, there was a trade-off. Russians were basically trading influence, because the number 2 in every of the republics was an ethnic Russian, for a much more weaker institutional representation. So when the disintegration of the Soviet Union happened, of course, it was much easier for some of the republics because the level of cohesion was very different. And of course, the Baltics was in a world of their own, because don't forget that the West never recognized the Baltic republics as part of the Soviet Union. But for the Russians, basically keeping what is to be Russian was the major question that, for example, Yeltsin administration was struggling with, and they never managed to get the answer. Because it turned out that the majority of the Russians don't know when is the Russian nation date. Even you probably don't know when is the Russian nation day. Secondly, 43% of the Russians in the beginning of 21st century believed that the borders of Russia are not final. Some believe that they should expand, but some believe that probably Russia is going to lose Chechnya and other places. At the same time, it was the Russians who decided on the end of the Soviet Union. And this is critically important, because if you're listening to President Putin, it was the West that has as their major objective to disintegrate Soviet Union. Historically, it's not true. George Bush Sr. was extremely cautious politician, which was very much afraid of a nuclear proliferation. So 10 days before the referendum in Ukraine, he went to Kiev and gave the famous Kiev chicken speech in which he asked the Ukrainians not to leave the Soviet Union. From this point of view, it was the decision of the Russian government. After the coup in 1991, it was basically the economists around Yeltsin who said Russia is not going to pay and keep the ruble zone for all others. We are not going to pay for Central Asians. What we're going to do is we're going to disintegrate the Soviet Union. This is the only way to remove Gorbachev. And after that, we're going to reintegrate Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. This was, by the way, this is also the old Solzhenitsyn idea of the natural borders of Russia. And Solzhenitsyn was quoted by President Putin on Valdai. So this is why we are going to see how the Russian nationalism is going to look like after this war. And this war, in my view, reminds me very much, and I'm not a historian, and I'm sure that Robert is already ready to correct me, for the fact that the Russian-Japanese war had on Russia in 1905, when basically Russian Empire believed that it is on rise. Of course, it was then demographically and economically going up, and for the first time in history, a non-white a state basically defeated a white empire, and this was a war which was incredible inspiration for Atatürk, for Sun Yat-sen, for all the people in the third world. I don't know exactly how the Russian nationalism is going to look like. And I'm going to end up on this because, in my view, the biggest divergence which we're going to see in the Western camp is not about to give weapons or not to Ukraine. And nevertheless, listen, nobody's particularly happy giving a lot of financial aid, but the aid will go. Even when part of the publics are going to be unhappy, European money will go, and by the way, yesterday, the European Commission came with an idea, and Germany agreed, which can make this really institutionally much more easy. European Commission most probably is going to raise a special, make debt, borrow, in order to give money for Ukraine, which means that you should not go to the nation states. And the biggest problem is Germany ready to agree, because basically Germany is the one who is guaranteeing, and this is going to happen. The biggest divergence is coming. What is the desired war end? And here the divide is real, and the divide goes between states, within the states. In my view, there are three different groups, how they defined what is the best. I'm not going to say the most realistic, but what you want to happen. One is the realists. Of course, Kissinger is the best example of this, who said Russia should not lose Russia should not win, Ukraine should not lose, and the war should not broaden. So the idea is to look for some face saving for the Russians. And you know the major argument against it. Give me a guarantees that this kind of a peace settlement is going to survive. Plus, it cannot be peace because I don't see any scenario under which West is going to recognize any of the Ukrainian territory as a legitimate part of the Russian Federation. But it is the Korean scenario. You have basically freezing conflict, which is going forever. The second is a classical Cold War approach, very much, in my view, supported in the United States, who said, listen, this is about the regime change. This is about Putin. If Putin is not there, we're going to have a different Russia, and this Russia can be integrated. And in a certain way, even it is a good idea, particularly keeping the fact that now China is the major opponent. But the third group, which is very strong in Ukraine, in Poland, in the Baltic republics, who is saying, listen, no, it's not about Russia. It's not Putin's war. It's Russia's war. It's about the imperial identity of Russia. So the only desirable outcome is a disintegration of the Russian Federation. So we should support separatist movements and so on. Listen, all of this, you have pro and cons, but this divide is very difficult, and very difficult to be reconciled because it awakens totally different historical experiences. This is not just rational differences, it's not simply, but this is where you are. It's normal that French, for example, are going to be much closer to the realists, that for the Americans, it's very much thinking in Cold War terms, it's about Putin, and it's also much more understandable for the Ukrainians, for the Balts, for the Poles. It is about all the history which comes with them. But reconciling this position is not going to be easy. And plus, all of the position can create the problems, all of them, for different levels and in a different time horizon.
So, Ivan, I'm going to say a couple of words very, very, very briefly before we go to a reception. And you can ask Ivan more questions if you like in the reception, but I think you might deserve a little break. So having said that, Ivan, let me just, you've been here a week, and I think you've realized that we have something really great going here. And I'm glad you came. And I note that you also acknowledge that the Monk School has a really global reputation.
You cannot come if you're not invited, so all go for them.
I don't know about that. There's a few people I've seen around here who haven't been invited, but that's a different issue. That was a joke, by the way. Sometimes hard to tell when I'm joking. I was joking. But no, I work in a great place. I wanted to thank again my coworkers. You got a chance to meet all of them because working at Saris right now Saris is never an ordinary place. It shouldn't be, and I wouldn't work there if it was ordinary. But as you know, we have this close encounter all the time. We have a staff that's almost entirely Ukrainian right now. We have our business officer Olga Kesarchuk, who comes from Cherkasy. We have Larissa Yarovenko, who's over there somewhere in the back. I think I see her husband, but I do not see her. She comes from Kiev. And we have Daria Glaskova, who comes from Odessa. And you've had the chance to meet all of them. But I want to thank them because this period has been really tough on all of us. And not just because I work with Ukrainians, but this is something that's, as you said, it's not just about Ukraine. It has to be taken in a really big picture perspective. And I keep stressing upon my students that this is something that you can't detach yourself from.
Can I say just one thing?
Of course.
On this? In order to see how Europe has changed this, before, when Europe was talking about itself, all the talk about European flags on a different pro-democracy demonstration outside of Europe, you're going to be surprised by the number of the Ukrainian flags in European capitals. Strangely enough, I see much less in Toronto, which because if I was surprised, but this is something that goes beyond state policies. And there is one person whom I want to thank very warmly, and this is the youngest gentleman here. We have somebody who is probably younger than 10.
Yes, that's Alex's son.
He's
8.
half Bulgarian. You can see how resilient Bulgarians are. On this age, surviving such a long talk, not particularly interesting for you. This is the future. This is basically what we can hope for.
I agree. Thank you for coming, young man. He is 8, okay, and he did survive, but give him a treat, eh, Alex? He's got a reception. I think he should bet to go to the buffet table first. I want to thank my students, particularly because, if you teach at University of Toronto, you're pretty lucky. If you don't think you're lucky, then that's your problem. It really is. But we have great students and really curious students, too, and you can see that and you met and engaged with them. And I appreciate your enthusiasm for these things as we spent the week together. And the last thing is to, I never, ever don't have a incredible experience when we, whether it's a lecture or a conversation with Gillian, our Director of Communications and Public Engagement. I did my first podcast. It was pretty modern. But I really enjoyed it, Gillian. And so we have a podcast. We're going to record this. This will be available. I really believe that we all learn a tremendous amount tonight. And I thank all of you for your enthusiasm, but particularly for Yvonne for being a regular visitor here and for being such a dear friend. And as I said, I hope our paths continue to cross. They will in Vienna, and I look forward to seeing you. And now I invite you to a reception. Thank you, everybody.